Anthony Blunt. He was so close to a breakdown at the end of the Second World War that he was allowed to go part-time. He only does the KGB odd jobs, but some of them were quite important after the Second World War.
As Blunt receded into the shadows, Donald Maclean was sent to Washington to work for the Foreign Office. Guy Burgess had left MI6 and had also taken a job at the Foreign Office in London. In 1950, the first Cold War military crisis presented the world with the alarming possibility of another major war. This time, Korea was the country that would ignite a tinderbox of tensions. Truman and Stalin watched the conflict closely. British leaders were concerned that America was willing to risk war with China and perhaps the Soviets to protect Korea from communism. Britain began working to prevent America from beginning another world war.
They decided they should hold talks and thresh out all the problems with the Americans. And they prepared special instructions for their group. And all this bunch of documents was passed to Stalin. It was clear from those documents that the West will not go to war with the Soviet Union about Korea.
Anthony Blunt was out of the Secret Service, but he was still helping his friend Guy Burgess.
Burgess and Blunt, they worked as a couple. Blunt had left MI5 and was not formally even connected with any secrets. So he was outside the circle of suspects, beyond suspicion. And of course it was much easier for him to meet Soviet contacts. At the same time, he was able to meet Burgess because they were lifelong friends. And he would take those papers from Burgess, photograph them secretly, and would pass the film to his Soviet contact.
Largely thanks to members of the Cambridge Five, Stalin knew just how far America was willing to go to protect Korea. But his intelligence didn't stop there. Among the many Soviet agents working to uncover atomic secrets, few were as important as John Cairncross. Before his arrival at Bletchley Park, Cairncross had briefly worked for an important advisor to Churchill, helping with plans to build a new and devastating weapon of war.
In 1940, he becomes private secretary to one of Churchill's ministers, Lord Hankey. He headed the Scientific Advisory Committee, which considered, amongst other things, the making of the first atomic bomb. And it was via Cairncross, using the minutes of Lord Hankey's committee, that Cairncross becomes the first of the atom spies. They hear it first from Cairncross.
By the late 1940s, Cairncross was once again privy to atomic secrets.
He was working in the Ministry of Supply, but he had access to a safe during that period which contained all the plans for Britain's nuclear deterrent and the expenditure on the armed services, information that the Soviets regarded as very significant indeed.
Soviet scientists, using the accounting ledgers and inventories supplied by Cairncross, were able to recreate and piece together some of the materials and steps required to build an atomic bomb. By 1950, the Cambridge Five were seasoned veterans in a complex game of cat and mouse. While the exact nature of many of their transgressions is to this day known only to a few in the British Secret Service, it's now clear that they provided the Soviets with volumes of information about the American and British intelligence services. For almost 10 years, the Cambridge Five had escaped detection. But they began to fall prey to a dangerous level of comfort and confidence. Philby would later speak of the hazards of letting one's guard down.
I remember Philby telling me that first time, maybe second time, third time, maybe a dozen times, when you're going to meet your contact, you always check yourself for surveillance and so on and so forth. But then suddenly you feel so secure that you don't do it anymore. You just walk out of the SAS building and in 20 minutes you meet a Soviet contact. Whereas under normal procedure, one should have spent 2 or 3 hours proving himself for surveillance.
For Donald Maclean, the pressure of leading a double life became more than he could bear. Transferred from Washington, Maclean was given a post at the British Embassy in Cairo. In Cairo, Maclean finally fell apart.
Donald Maclean does have a nervous breakdown, although it's of a pretty bizarre kind. It reaches a peak, I suppose, in Cairo, where he was a British diplomat, in the spring of 1950. And with one of his friends, he goes on an extraordinary mission of destruction to the apartment of two secretaries working at the American Embassy.
After a brief hospital stay, Maclean was not only reassigned, he was promoted and sent back to London. Far from arousing suspicion, his behavior was attributed to his intense devotion to his work and his long hours of service to the Crown.
Amazingly, despite complaints from the American embassy, he subsequently went on to head the American department in the British Foreign Office.
At the end of the 1940s, Kim Philby was sent to Washington, D.C. as an MI6 representative. It was there that he learned of an alarming secret project, a project that would spell the beginning of the end for the greatest spy ring in history. By 1950, the Cambridge Five were beginning to weaken under the intense pressure of living secret lives. Their days as Soviet spies were numbered. Kim Philby and Guy Burgess had been transferred to Washington, D.C. Donald Maclean had left Washington and, despite his unstable behavior, had been named head of the American Division of the Foreign Service. Evidence of serious personal problems notwithstanding, the Cambridge spies were supported by the very system they were betraying.
It is truly astonishing the way in which they manipulated the system, the class structure in this country, social mores of the time, in order to be able to advance their own careers and prevent themselves from falling into some of the most obvious pitfalls.
The head of MI6 was so impressed with Kim Philby that he appointed him as liaison to the American Secret Service. By 1950, Burgess had also been transferred to Washington, where he had access to important documents on Cold War planning being conducted by the British and Americans. When Burgess arrived in Washington, he moved in with Philby and his family, an unwise but necessary decision given Burgess's health.
Burgess was getting worse and worse. I mean, his health was suffering. He was drinking too much. He was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
By living under the same roof, Philby and Burgess had broken the first rule of spying, and it would soon prove to be their undoing. The beginning of the end for the Cambridge Five came in the early 1950s. During the Second World War, messages from Soviet embassies in the West were routinely intercepted by American intelligence. But the time-consuming process of decoding these secret communiques made progress slow. As the Cold War began, however, the decoding of these old messages became a top priority. The effort by the Americans to intercept and decipher these secret messages was codenamed Venona.
In 1944, there was some evidence that there was a leak in the British Embassy in Washington. Between 1944 and 1949, an enormous amount of work was done on intercepting and decrypting some of the Soviets' most secret telegrams.
Philby's status in the Secret Service gave him extraordinary access to the progress of the Venona project. Breaking the code was a slow process, but soon important clues about Soviet agents were emerging. An agent with the code name of Homer was identified, and some important information about his personal life was revealed. Kim Philby knew immediately that Donald Maclean was Homer.
It became clear from one clue that Homer was based at the British Embassy in Washington and that he had been given permission to regularly visit his wife, who was pregnant, in New York. and that person was Donald Maclean.
Knowing it was only a matter of time before Maclean was discovered, Philby and Burgess had to find a way to warn Maclean, who was over 3,500 miles away in London. Any direct communication was out of the question.
The answer was, since Burgess hated his posting anyway, had fallen out with most of his colleagues in the State Department, why don't we get him sent back in disgrace? So Burgess took a car trip in a big ostentatious car and broke the speed limits of, say, 3 states, and then each case was insulting and rude to the arresting officer, claimed diplomatic immunity. The governors of the 3 states complained to the State Department, who complained to the embassy, and Burgess was effectively told to go home.
Back in London, Burgess was able to meet with his old friend Maclean and warn him of the investigation. But journalists and scholars now question the truthfulness of this plan to warn Maclean. It's possible that Philby told this story because it's what he wanted people to believe.
There are a few flaws in the story, however, we dissident spy watchers wonder about. If the idea was to get him back quickly, why then did it take 6 weeks before he actually left?
Philby might have told this story to protect another secret agent in MI5, one whose identity remains a mystery to this day. What happened next is not disputed. Burgess understood that Maclean would have to defect. In his unstable condition, Maclean would never hold up to interrogation. Nor could he make the trip and escape alone. Burgess would help him. Passage was booked on a weekend cruise across the Channel. Since the ships on this cruise docked for only a day in France, passports were rarely checked. Burgess and Maclean quietly slipped into France and then together vanished behind the Iron Curtain. To this day, only the KGB knows the exact route they took. Maclean's defection surprised the secret services of America and Britain, but Burgess's defection shocked everyone, including his former housemate, Kim Philby.
When Philby discovered that Donald Maclean had escaped, I think that he must have been absolutely delighted. He was equally horrified to be informed that Guy Burgess had defected with Donald Maclean. That was never part of the plan. But it subsequently emerged that Maclean was so shaky at that stage that Guy Burgess really didn't believe that Maclean would be able to make the journey on his own.